I had to give Jay a hard time. The Irish town of Schwartz. I like that. Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I enjoy the Pioneer Institute, and I just have to acknowledge the work that Jim Sturgis and Jamie Gass and the whole team do to advance the cause of parental choice and quality options for children. I think we need to give them a hand for their work. Thank you very much. So someone very close to me, good friend, I told her I was going to be here, and she's seen a lot of my speeches and heard me speak. He said, Kevin, you know, you have this tendency to pound the table a little bit. You may want to dial it down a little bit when you get to Boston. And I thought about that. He said, because you know, you're a calmer person than what you appear on some of those tapes and in person. And I said, nah, I'm not going to do that. This has become my life's work. As Jay indicated, I was on the DC Council for 12 years and helped shepherd our charter school movement and then our scholarship program. And at the end of the day, I feel like I'm a missionary, so sometimes missionaries do have to pound the table. So for those of you who get a little bit taken aback, I won't apologize. But let me just tell you what I'm going to do. I want to talk about in three general areas. One, I want to talk about the need and why it's important for us to expand quality options for our children. A lot of this is self-evident, but I do want to touch on that, and I think it's important to set the table in that regard. And then I want to talk about why we can't fix things. People always say, why can't we get schools right? Why can't we make the changes we need to make to benefit our children? And I'll talk about that. And then finally, just share my hope for the future and why I believe we're going to win this thing. So the need. Things are still bad in terms of the quality of education that we offer the lion's share of our children in this country. And I know it's important for me to start this conversation with that statement here in Massachusetts, because there are some folks in this great state, the site of the founding of our revolution, the American Revolution, that have this delusional view that you're number one in education, so everything's okay. Well, let me share something with you. If you're number one in a country that ranks in the low to mid-20s among other industrialized nations in the world in terms of educational outputs, that's nothing to be proud of. If you're number one, when in most of your cities, 60 to 70% of your children are in schools that are underperforming, that's nothing to be proud of. If you're number one, when you know that even in this so-called great state, this the number one performing state in terms of educational outputs in the country, that still zip code and accident of birth are the most important ingredients in determining whether or not you're going to get a quality education, that is nothing to be proud of. So Massachusetts does need to wake up and recognize that this pumping of the chest and raising of the fist because you're number one really means that you have as much or more work to do than anyone else. And in terms of anyone else, it is clear in this country that we still are failing our children. The achievement gap continues to grow, not just among children of color and their white counterparts around this country, but indeed, as the McKinsey report showed a couple of years ago when they did the first ever study of the economic impact of the three major achievement gaps, all those gaps continue to grow even to this day. In that landmark report, they said if there was a way to quantify our failure to close these existing achievement gaps, what would that look like? And they looked at the three gaps that encompass, the comparison between all school-aged children in this country who come from low-income families and their peers who come from families with means, all school-aged children of color compared to their white counterparts, and then all American school-aged children when compared to other school-age children from industrialized nations around the world. And in all three of those gaps, they continue to grow. And they said if we had closed, our failure to close those gaps has led to an impact on our gross domestic product of $2 to $3 trillion. A permanent national recession larger than the one we're going through. If we had begun to close those gaps, it will make a huge difference to the economic well-being of our country. In response to that, now we are facing a catastrophic future economically, because with those gaps continuing to grow, what we are creating in effect is a growing and burgeoning permanent underclass. Folks who will end up being part of this dependent care population, wards of the state in one way or the other. Now, when I say wards of the state, I'm not just talking about public assistance or welfare. Wards of the state being the biggest caretaker, our prison system, where our failure to spend $7,000 to $10,000 or $12,000 to $15,000 effectively per child leads to us spending upwards of $70,000 to $80,000 per inmate down the road. So the need is clearly there. And what's really frustrating is we do know how to educate a child. If you ratchet down this whole notion of education reform, what that means, and teacher quality, it really comes down to that holistic one-on-one experience between a teacher in a classroom and a student in that classroom. And a good teacher can educate any child, irrespective of their demographics, their socioeconomic standing, irrespective of all the challenges they may come from. A good teacher can educate any child. And it's important to know that, because there are still those, even in the education reform movement, say, well, some of those kids really can't learn because of where they come from. Well, that is hogwash. A good teacher can educate any child. And we need to be clear about that. And what's frustrating is that we know that can happen. So the question is, and we also know what works. We know that those good teachers adhere to higher standards, high expectations. There's no dumbing down. This dumbing down phenomenon, to me, is most insidious. The dumbing down has been systematized so that they offer, some of these book publishing companies will offer the classics in abridged version. So instead of War and Peace being, 1,000 pages, it may be 699 or something. And this dumbing down has existed to the point where businesses have to compensate for the lack of education that their employees have. So that's why McDonald's was the first ones to put the pictures of the hamburgers and the fries on the cash register, because the kids can't count and they can't read. And they wanted to make sure they continue to employ them. And my former law firm was one of McDonald's big lawyers early on, and sitting in a room and many years ago, and they had these artists and graphic designers come in to debate the efficacy of the picture of a Big Mac versus a quarter pounder. Is it accurate? Because we want to make sure when those kids push that picture, they're pushing the right sandwich photo. So we've dumbed down to the point where even business has to try to find a way to compensate for what we don't allow to happen in the classroom. And then, this innovation and creativity, all been stifled. Good teachers can do it, but the bad systems don't let them do it. So why can't this happen? This leads to the second point I want to make. Why can't we allow good quality teachers to be in every classroom? And why can't we allow those who come from the most challenged backgrounds, the most challenged zip codes, get access to the highest quality education? And why haven't we closed this achievement gap for the past 30 years? Why can't we fix what ails our schools, especially when we know what works? Well, Jay touched on it. Yes, it's an issue of power. But it's also, more than anything, I believe, an issue of courage. there just isn't the will to do what's right. In most areas of our democracy, we expect our leaders to lead us. And in this area, our leaders refuse to lead us because they have betrayed their trust to us by selling out to the powers that be and refusing to take courageous stands that benefit children. So they will just give platitudes about education. I support more money for our teachers, period. I support education. I want to be your education president. Well, what does that mean? You know, what are you going to do to ensure that each and every child has equal access to high quality education or equal choices? What would you do that would fly in the face of challenging the status quo? Would you support performance pay measures? Would you break up automatic tenure rules? And then they back away. So we expect our leaders to lead us. They won't do it in education. So who are we left with to carry the mantle in this fight? Well, fortunately, we have folks like the Pioneer Institute, which is probably the best, clearly among the best in the country. And we have these little guerrilla army folks and these crazy people like me who run around and say we need to do these things. But we also have, you know, this education reform movement where, you know, people have done amazing things. You know, the Teach for Americas and the KIPP folks and the charter school operators and folks like the American Federation of Children who I'm doing work with, and you're going to hear from Scott later, you know, Bale, Deefer. You got all these folks out here who are doing some of this work, but, you know, for the most part, as we rely on the ed reformers, since we can't rely on our leaders, as we rely on our ed reformers, many of them are what I call drive-by education reformers. They really don't fight for our kids. They compartmentalize the fight. You've heard of Bud Light or Pepsi Light. I call it ed reform light. Because these people are very selective about what they would support, even in the area of education reform. For instance, they're ready to accept incrementalism. You know, the next 3 to 5 year school reform plan de jour that supplants the previous 3 to 5 year education reform plan de jour. The Lawrence situation. You take it over in '98, we're going to get it right. And now we're going to take it over again and we're going to get it right. These drive-by reformers, they will support charters, maybe, but not vouchers. They'll support some performance pay, but don't tie it to all this stuff to teachers' evaluations of kids' performance. There's no need for competition according to these drive-by reformers. You know, we can reform from within, just give us time. You know, it's a little bit of this, but not a lot of that. And at the end of the day, many drive-by reformers say, you know, at all costs, we must preserve the system. The system. The system. Everyone wants to say we have to save our education system. It's so sacrosanct, our educational system. Well, I tell you, I don't believe that the most important thing in education is the education system. I think the most important thing in education is educating each and every one of our children. That's the most important thing. And for those who are so wed to preserving the integrity of this public education system, we need to step back and remind folks that maybe it's okay to support a quality system of schools that educate our children, as opposed to doing all we can at the expense of children to prop up a system that ultimately fails them. And since we have leaderless leaders on this issue, and we have some of our so-called education reformers who think in compartmentalized boxes, The hope for the future I see is in the parents. Because parents are beginning to wake up, and they are thinking in terms of a revolution. Any other place but Boston, that word would be scary, revolution. But you know, we need a revolution in education in this country. One that emphasizes, as Dr. King said in the 1960s, the fierce urgency of now. And the reason why we remember that phrase is because he did not say the fierce urgency of yesterday or the fierce urgency of tomorrow when we finish the 3 to 5 year school reform plan de jour. He said the fierce urgency of now, because he was making the point. During the civil rights movement, like all movements, they become successful when urgency is attached to the cause. They become successful when those who are fighting for the movement have a personal commitment. That's virtually the centerpiece of their existence. Dr. King kept talking about the interconnectedness of all of us as we examine and pursue that fierce urgency of now. And like all other meaningful movements, no movement for right has been won without a revolution, a personal commitment. Let's think about and talk about the American Revolution, right here in this great state. Those of you who know the history, it's born and bred in your bones. Those of you who are respecters of history know that George Washington lost 6 of the 9 battles with the British. That means he won 3 of 9, if you have problems with math. He lost twice as many as he won. But you know, with each battle that he lost with the British, King George would send emissaries over to George Washington to try to make overtures. Stop fighting. We'll stop taxing the tea. What do you need? You can be my surrogate king over here, whatever. Even though the British kept winning. But at the end of the day, and the reason why King George kept sending those emissaries over to General Washington was he understood that he was fighting something bigger than just George Washington. He was fighting a spirit that he couldn't beat. Because every time the British would beat some musket-carrying, frostbitten, feet-having farmer, another one would take his place. And he said, these armies are going to continue to supplant themselves. I can't win this war when the people are so invested in the fight. That's why we won the American Revolution. The same thing happened during the 60s with Dr. King. On the eve of the legendary fight in Birmingham, where Bull Connor sicked dogs and they had fire hoses on those children. Well, what led up to that was the march was supposed to start at 12 noon. And Dr. King and his lieutenants were nervous about not having people show up. Bull Connor and the city fathers of Birmingham had done a real good job of convincing, you know, the liberal whites and the blacks who were of influence and the leaders to stay at home. So King really worried whether anyone would show up. But Bull Connor and the city fathers of Birmingham knew that the children would probably come. So what they did to try to preempt that, they nailed the doors to the black schoolhouses shut, nailed the windows shut so the kids couldn't come to the march. And at that 12 o'clock hour, thousands of black children burst through those doors in the black schoolhouses, broke the windows, some dripping blood from broken glass having been cut trying to get to the march. Thousands of children filled the jail cells in Birmingham. And America saw those images of the fire hoses and the dogs. You had as many as 80 to 100 school-aged children in jail cells fit for 8 people. They were there days at a time. One 6-year-old girl was interviewed on the evening news being led away in a paddy wagon and was asked, "Why did you break out of school to march with Dr. King?" And she said, "Because I'm fighting for my freedom and my education." Just like those musket-carrying, frostbitten, feet-having farmers, it was clear that Bull Connor and the city fathers of Birmingham could not kill that spirit. Even today, there's examples of people being so invested in a movement that they can make a change in the status quo almost instantaneously. Just last year in Egypt, when Mubarak, one of the biggest dictators in the world, had been there for years, people got fed up. So they went to the streets. And Mubarak had one of those political press conferences that said, "All right, I'm going to leave at the end of the year." More Egyptians went to the street. So a couple days later, he said, "Okay, I've named a vice president who's going to succeed me in 6 months." And more Egyptians went to the street. And then he had a press conference, "I'm going to leave at the end of the month." More Egyptians flooded the streets. So then he announced, "I'm stepping down today." We need some Egyptians up in here to go to the streets for our children to get them a high-quality education. That's the mindset we need. And that's the mindset, frankly, that is growing among parents. So when people hear me talk about revolution and I give these examples and these data points and these analogs, they say, "Well, how do you know when you're in a revolution or when the revolution is taking hold in the area of education? How do you know that?" And, well, I have a couple of examples. First of all, when the silent majority is no longer silent, you're on the verge of a revolution. When the masses begin to speak, when there's percolation in areas where nothing percolated before, when people begin to take action to assert themselves, that's when you know you're on the verge of a revolution. And more importantly, when these people, like that little girl who was led to that jail cell in Birmingham, when the people start to lead the leaders. Today, parents and real people are beginning to take action in this issue of education reform. Last year, Kelly Williams Bolar in Akron, Ohio, was arrested, charged, put through a trial, convicted, and sentenced to 10 days for using her father's address to put her daughter in a better school. The Akron School District is one of the worst school districts in Ohio, and the judge in sentencing Kelly Williams Bolar said, "You should be ashamed of yourself for stealing an education from the state. We need to make an example of you, and I'm sentencing you to 10 days in jail." She was concerned legitimately about the safety of her child, and what that judge should have done was held the city of Akron in contempt for having a failing school district. But Kelly Williams Bolar was taking a stand. And I would just say, even in this great state with your great educational outcomes, I know it's none of you, but I will ask if anyone knows anyone who used someone else's address to get in a better school to raise your hand. I'm sure that there are those of you who know people who've used other folks' address to get into a better school. In fact, Joe Klein told me in New York it was a cottage industry where some people will pay thousands of dollars a month to use a friend's address so they'd have the right zip code to send their kid to a better school. Just the other day, a woman was sentenced to jail for doing the same thing. Now we have, these school districts growing their budget to hire private detectives to videotape these mothers from low-income families who have their children in their schools to make sure that they're not stealing an education. But these parents are beginning to step up. Kelly Williams-Bolar and folks like Gwen Samuel in Connecticut are starting their own parent revolution. They had a rally in Hartford just yesterday. Shirley Ford and those LA Latino parents that work with Democrats for Education Reform to start the first parent trigger law in California. Parent trigger law is now pending in several states. And what it does, if your kid goes to a failing school and there's been no change, and you get 51% of the parents to sign a petition for change, then the school district has to replace the principal and put in new leadership. And versions of that law is being promulgated all over. But of course, the status quo does fight back, because in California, they had the first parent trigger law. Those Latino parents who led that fight were faced ridicule, harassment, and abuse by the school district, so much so that the union threatened to, said that they could deport some of those parents if they weren't American citizens. They wanted to question the authenticity of some of the signatures, and so on. Fortunately, those things didn't work. So these leaders, these families, these parents, these folks who want change are beginning to assert themselves. I spent a lot of time in Louisiana working with parents who were part of the charter movement there, the scholarship movement there, the voucher movement there, and they are stepping up. They're saying, let me march. Let me make sure that I can have a voice so that we can impact on the change that needs to take place. And you know what? Sooner or later, our leaders need to fall in line. With all the crazy stuff that we've seen from these so-called presidential candidates, none of them talk at all about education. To me, the most important issue that it provides the underpinning for our future economy and ensures the preservation of our democracy. So what should our leaders be doing? Well, frankly, one important ingredient that is not mentioned enough, and all of these presidential candidates, and the president himself needs to do more of this, is talk about national pride when it comes to a positive culture of learning. We need to start talking about education in not just punitive terms, which we're all good at doing, even yours truly. Talking about what we're not doing, our failures. But we need to celebrate those examples of positive learning that exist. We need to celebrate the fact that a woman can grow up in public housing, come from 3 or 4 generations of family members who didn't graduate from high school, can go back and get her GED. We need to celebrate the fact that Kelly Williams-Bolar, yes, she used her father's address to try to get her daughter in a better school, but she was just 2 classes away from getting her college degree, having worked and struggled and saved and scrimped for years to finally get on the verge of a college degree. And the rallying cry should be on celebrating, supporting those things, whatever those things may be, that help a child learn. And it shouldn't come from a Democrat or Republican perspective, but from an American perspective. Our leaders need to embrace change for families that need help now. Like, for instance, wouldn't it be revolutionary if Democrats and Republicans alike in our leadership would stand up and say, I support the education of all of our children by any means necessary. Traditional public charter, scholarships, tax credits, virtual schools, magnet schools, specialty schools, anything that's going to help a child learn. Wouldn't it be revolutionary, indeed, if the real measuring stick on what our leaders would support centered around one basic premise? Will this help a child or group of children learn? If the answer is yes, I'm for it. If it's no, I'm against it. Wouldn't it be revolutionary when you examine the budgets of school districts that each and every person who is receiving a paycheck in the school district must be able to account for how their daily activities accelerate the learning that happens in the classroom. So we can take away the assistant to the deputy to the assistant of curriculum, or the deputy assistant facilities person who is the fourth in line to check a box on whether a principal can rent out her gym to a community group. Wouldn't it be revolutionary if our leaders just stood up and said that yes, teacher, like other professions, we need the best. So your performance is going to be tied in some measure to the outputs in the classroom. And wouldn't it be revolutionary if they said, for those teachers, that good fifth grade teacher, we know you're a good teacher, but we know you've been struggling because the fourth grade teacher and the third grade teacher aren't quality teachers. And we know you get students who are 2 or 3 grades behind, and you have been silent because it's a conspiracy of silence. Wouldn't it be great if our leaders said to those teachers, those good teachers who have to clean up the mess of the folks who give it to them, it's okay. We're going to make sure we replace that 3rd and 4th grade teacher so that you don't have to clean up the mess. Other nations are outstripping us not because they're smarter. And frankly, it's not just because they have better systems. They do celebrate this positive culture of learning, and we don't. When I was in Taiwan, and I visited a school, and a teacher pointed out this 8-year-old boy who spoke fluent English and worked harder than anyone in the school, she said. So I chatted with that boy and asked him, I said, why do you work so hard? And he said, it's because of my duty to my family and my country in fluent English. Now, I haven't had any 8-year-old boys in the States say that to me. And you know, that's why they're cleaning our clock. Because there's something inbred in that culture that celebrates this positive culture of learning and celebrates the fact that we need to be the best that we can be for our country when it comes to maximizing our education. See, we need to plant those seeds that matter, and our leaders need to do that. Education shouldn't be something the president talks about at the start of school. Just like we rally around women's soccer, or JFK says we're going to be the first to go to the moon, or the Olympic Games every 4 years. There's nothing wrong with our leaders talking about education in this way. And wouldn't it be revolutionary for Republicans and Democrats alike to say, on this matter, we're going to throw partisanship out the door. Because our country's future, our country's democracy depends on us banding together as a nation and doing what's right for these kids. Unfortunately now, though, our leaders are asleep. They have decided to stick their finger to the wind. Even your governor here, who may want to be President King of England, I don't know. But even your governor here has decided that on this issue, he's going to play it safe. And as much as I respect President Obama for what he's done with the charter movement and talking about performance pay, President Obama decided he was going to kill our program in D.C., our scholarship program, even though some of those kids who came from schools where 85% of the kids were failing, even though some of those kids would sit in class with Sasha and Malia and not have to pay for it. The president wanted to kill our program. It's time for our leaders to wake up. The status quo is unacceptable. And not only is it bad for these families, it's bad for our nation. On the Sunday before he died, Dr. King gave his final sermon at the National Cathedral Church in Washington, D.C. The title of his sermon, just a couple days before he was killed, was Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution. And in his sermon, Dr. King referenced the popular book at the time by Washington Irving, Rip Van Winkle. And the thing about Rip Van Winkle, if you remember, he went up to the mountains and he fell asleep for 20 years and he came back down the mountain. But as King mentions in this wonderful sermon, he says, most people focus on the fact that Rip Van Winkle was sleeping for 20 years. But that wasn't Washington Irving's point of the story. Because the real point is that when Rip went up into the mountain, there was a picture of King George standing outside on the post. When Rip came down from the mountain, that picture of King George had been replaced by a picture of George Washington. And Dr. King says this, and I quote, "The most striking thing about the story of Rip Van Winkle is not merely that he slept 20 years, but that he slept through a revolution. While he was peacefully snoring up in a mountain, a revolution was taking place that at points would change history, and Rip Van Winkle knew nothing about it. He was asleep. Yes, he slept through a revolution." Dr. King further says, "And one of the great liabilities of life is that all too many people find themselves living amid a period of social change, and yet they fail to develop the new attitudes, the new mental responses that the situation demands. Too many people end up sleeping through a revolution." See, folks, we're on the verge of a revolution in education, and many don't even know it, not the least of which includes many of our leaders. And like Rip, unfortunately, some may end up sleeping through that revolution. But it is incumbent on each of us to do all we can to be pure on this issue, to put partisanship aside, to support parents like Kelly Williams-Bolar or those LA Latino parents, to make sure we stand on principle and, as Jay said, speak truth to power. The need to ensure that each and every American child have equal access to a high-quality education is now a national imperative. And like other revolutions in which a personal commitment and a spirit was born that could not be broken, like the American Revolution, the Civil Rights Movement, and yeah, those folks in Egypt, we need to take that mantle and employ the same tactics in this nation to get our kids educated. And we need to fight like we mean it, because our children, their parents, and indeed our nation deserves nothing less. Thank you all very much.